pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm just going to share my slides with you all. And as you just heard, I will be talking about eco-anxiety and denialism, young people and the climate catastrophe. My name is Dr. Marc Williams, and I am joining you today from Cardiff University in South Wales. So I want to talk about an argument that societal denial about climate change is contributing to eco-anxiety. And when I say eco-anxiety, I mean a chronic fear of environmental doom or environmental catastrophe, when people find that they are very worried about climate change and sometimes so worried that it is hard for them to live their lives normally. You can see on the side here 3 monkeys. The monkey who sees no evil, says no evil, and hears no evil. And I want to think about denialism on a societal level. We all know that denial is something that humans can experience. All of us at some point try to deny what is happening. Maybe there are inconvenient truths in our lives. Maybe there are things that we would prefer not to think about. But as a society, we can also deny big things that are happening. I think one example of this was when COVID happened, when the pandemic happened. We were, at least in the UK, quite slow to acknowledge that this was a problem. And so there was a wide societal denial happening until the problem got to be very bad. So climate change, we are denying this in many ways, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next few slides. I will argue today that societal denial transfers the responsibility for tackling climate change to young people. I think also that denialism invalidates legitimate anxieties, and denialism gets in the way of appropriate action to combat climate change. And I will also talk about some ways that we can help this situation, and in particular, how we can help young people with eco-anxiety. So some background. We hear about climate change more and more in the news and on social media. Young people in particular hear a lot about climate change. In the UK, climate change is taught in schools. So usually young people know even more than adults do about climate change and climate science. But what the science tells us is that human influence on the Earth's climate is can't be doubted. We know that it is happening. It is becoming more apparent and widespread, and scientists form the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, and scientists are largely, in consensus that climate change is happening and humans are causing climate change. And there are some very worrying statistics. So by 2070, up to 3 billion people are likely to live in climate conditions unsuitable for human life to flourish. And the IPCC gives different estimates for different outcomes depending on how much the planet heats up. With 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, 6 million people in coastal areas will be affected by sea level rise by the end of this century. And this number goes up to 16 million with 2 degrees of warming. And between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause about 250,000 additional deaths per year from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress. So climate change is a big problem for human health. And in the UK, which is where I'm based, the Royal College of Psychiatrists is taking this very seriously, and now other professions like clinical psychology are also starting to take it seriously. But this is a diagram showing the evidence that climate change affects mental health in lots of ways. We know that there's a strong evidence for the effect of hot temperatures on mental health, and also in hotter temperatures, suicide rates go up. We know that extreme weather events like storms and floods cause traumatic reactions like post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's lots of ways that climate change impacts on mental health. Young people are particularly worried about climate change. So eco-anxiety is higher in young people. And I want to talk a bit about why that is. Young people are affected in lots of ways by climate change. Even before babies are born, we know that heat waves increase obstetric complications, increase preterm births and stillbirths. We know that maternal stress from extreme weather events can affect how children develop cognitively and behaviorally. In early and middle childhood, we know that secure social bonds are important for psychological and emotional development, but extreme weather events can disrupt these bonds, which then can give rise to mental health problems in young people, including sleep problems, depression, anxiety, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. In adolescence, this is when young people start to develop higher level thinking skills like abstract reasoning. And this might be one of the reasons that young people are becoming more and more worried about climate change, because climate change is a complicated issue, and it is also a problem that causes a lot of unfairness, because some people are going to be more badly affected than other people. So that might be one of the reasons that young people, especially adolescents, get very emotional and anxious about climate change, because it has lots of impacts and it also causes a lot of inequality. There's a concept of moral injury. And adolescents are prone to feeling frustrated about the lack of political action against climate change. So when you are part of a group like humans, and that group is causing damage to the planet, you can feel morally implicated. You can feel moral injury because of what humans are doing and because you are part of the human race. I wanted to share with you a study that was conducted across 10 different countries and multiple continents. And it was a study that asked young people below the age of 25 how they thought about climate change. And this is just one thing that came out of the study. You can see that in the red bars show when young people were extremely worried about climate change. And these are quite high numbers. Lots of young children in many countries are extremely worried. The orange shows very worried, and the yellow is moderately worried. So the majority of young people across the globe say they are at least moderately worried about climate change. So how is denialism relevant to this? I When I think about denialism, I think of one of my favorite books. I've shown you a picture here. It's called Staring at the Sun by a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist called Irvin Yalom. Um, some of you might have heard of this person or might have read this book. And the idea in this book is that humans are very afraid of death and don't like thinking about death. And thinking about death is like staring at the sun. We don't stare at the sun, we look away because it's too bright, it's too unfathomable, it's too overwhelming. And I think that climate change is similar to this. It is so big and overwhelming and unfathomable that we can't get our heads around it. We can't understand it. It's so huge. So denial is something that we do on a social scale. It is not just something that individuals do, but I believe that entire groups, businesses, corporations, the media is motivated to pretend this is not happening and to pretend it's not as bad as it really is in order not to have to face the implications, because the implications are that we all have to change how we live in order not to cause damage to the planet. And usually humans don't want to change how they live. The idea of cognitive dissonance is relevant. So, cognitive dissonance is when you think two things that are different from each other. An example might be when someone smokes lots of cigarettes, but also knows that smoking is bad for them. So there are two things there in contrast, and that causes a mental tension. And one way of relieving the tension is to stop smoking. The other way is to tell yourself that actually smoking really isn't that bad. So cognitive dissonance is how we deal with things that we don't like to think about or things that make us feel bad. Climate change makes us feel bad. We don't want to think about it. So one thing we do as a society is, in a way, pretend it's not as bad as we think it is. This isn't just adults, it's also young people. There was a study that I did with young people in the UK who said that even though they sometimes feel worried about climate change, sometimes they also like to pretend it's not happening and live in a state of ignorant bliss. There are some ways society can counteract denialism. Um, I don't know if this happens in Brazil, but in the UK, we have things called, well, obviously climate protests, but I was going to say climate cafes, where people get together to talk about how worried they are about climate change. And interestingly, climate cafes are based on the idea of a death cafe, which is a kind of meeting where people talk about death. The reason for death cafes is that usually when people talk about death or their fear of death, especially people who have serious health problems and who are thinking about death a lot, we tend not to let people talk about it, and we tend to ignore or shut down those conversations. So the idea of a climate cafe, just like a death cafe, is to counteract some of the denial that happens on a social level. There's a related concept to denial called Disavowal. There's a really good book by Sally Weintraub, who is a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. So she does psychoanalysis, and she uses that theory to help us understand why do we respond in this way to climate change. In states of disavowal, we hold incompatible beliefs. And one of the ways that we're able to do this is that we we take away the emotional impact of a belief. Um, so there's a long quote here, but I'll summarize it for you. That one way of denying climate change is not to pretend it's not happening. Many people now do agree that climate change is real and it's happening, but we can engage in what's called a soft denial or disavowal, where we tell ourselves, well, yes, it is happening, but it's not that bad and it's not going to affect me. So it drains the meaning out of that knowledge and it makes it less emotionally impactful. So one thing that happens when we deny climate change as a society is that young people, especially young people who are learning about climate change in school, they are learning about it on social media, they're learning about it from their friends. As I said before, young people know a lot about climate change usually, at least in the UK. Young people often know more than adults do. And what this means is that there is a strange mismatch between the knowledge that young people have and the silence that happens on a societal level. What that means is that you could call this an intergenerational burden. And there's been research to show that even though older people, so older demographics, and younger demographics have become more similar in how much they believe in climate change. One gap that still exists is that while younger people are more emotionally impacted by climate change, older people have less of a strong emotional response. And there's lots of reasons why that might be, but one of them is that young people have obviously more time ahead of them for climate change to have an impact. And young people worry then about their future, about what kind of job they can have, about social stability, and about all the nature that they enjoy that will start to become affected in the years to come. And we know that in the research, young people often feel that older people and adults have failed to take care of the planet. So there's a kind of an intergenerational relationship where there's sort of differences in how young people see older people and feel older people are responsible for the current situation. Um, about half of young people have said that they worry so much about climate change that it has a negative impact on their daily life and functioning. So this isn't just a worry in their heads, it actually changes how they're able to live their lives. That might mean it affects how they work, how well they engage in their studies, it affects how they socialize. So, these statistics are from that study I showed you before, where researchers looked at young people across 10 different countries. And it was a very large sample. It was about 10,000 young people who completed that study. So it's quite, in some ways, quite reliable data. And other research has also found, oops, sorry, other research has also found that young people or young adults feel that older adults are not taking their climate concerns seriously enough. So I want to share with you now another study that I have been involved in. So we did a meta-synthesis, which is a kind of review of papers. We looked at many different papers that have been published, and we summarized and synthesized the findings. And this review found that young people who are very worried, so young people with eco-anxiety, um, they try to cope with their eco-anxiety in different ways. And often what young people say is that they alternate between either stepping in, so engaging with the climate movement. So that might be, engaging with climate action groups, and that they do this because, again, I mentioned the moral injury before. Lots of young people who worry about climate change feel a sense of moral injury where they know what's happening is wrong. They know that humans are causing harm, and they feel sort of morally implicated in that. So, one way of coping with that feeling is to try and do something about climate change by engaging with the climate movement. But one of the problems with that is that many young people say that trying to tackle climate change is very difficult, very tiring, and it drains them of their energy. And so a lot of the time, it's not something that's sustainable. It's not something that they can carry on doing without burning out. So what then happens is that young people often have to step away, step out of the climate movement, where they try not to think about climate change. They try not to engage with it at all, which means that they have more energy because they're not spending all of their energies trying to stop climate change. But the bad thing about that is that then they feel bad. They feel that they should be doing something about this because no one else is doing anything, or it seems as though governments aren't doing very much. But then when they try to take some time for themselves and try to relax, they find it very hard to relax. So, in some ways, young people with eco anxiety are in a bit of a dilemma. So, another problem with denialism at the social level is that it can invalidate legitimate concerns. So, again, in that study of 10,000 young people, um, some young people, about 80% of the sample, said they tried to talk with others about climate change, but almost half of those reported that other people had ignored them or dismissed their concerns. So we can see that denial, that denialism happening in interactions with other people. You try to talk about something and other people ignore you or tell you not to worry. Um, so I've just noticed a question has come up in the chat, but I think I'll come back to the questions at the end if that's okay. So in the US, they've done studies on psychological therapists. So they've asked therapists, about their experiences of providing therapy to people with eco-anxiety. And many therapists say that they've never met someone who talks about climate change. About half of the therapists said that. A third said about one or two clients had talked about climate change worry. And then the rest of the sample, about 17%, said they had at least three clients who were worried about climate change. So that's quite big numbers if you consider all the other things that you could talk about in therapy. Quite a few people are talking about climate change. What the researchers found was that therapists' own concerns about climate change led them to either privilege and prioritize conversations about this or to minimize what clients were saying. So if a therapist themselves is worried about climate change, maybe they're more likely to talk about that with their patients when the patients raise it. But if the therapist isn't worried about climate change, then they tend to dismiss and minimize what patients talk about. And that's been found in other studies as well. There was a study in Australia that found a similar thing. So I've just added a reference at the end there because that's something that we discussed in a recent paper. So another thing I want to talk about is how when we deny something, in some ways that can make it harder for people to act. So societal denial of climate change can actually lead people to be less active in trying to tackle climate change. And I think that one way this happens is how it affects our sense of efficacy, or what you could call our sense of confidence in our ability to tackle climate change. So I'm just sharing a study here that we published recently that looked at climate anxiety in the United Kingdom and whether people who are more anxious about climate change are more likely to engage in what we call pro-environmental behaviors, behaviors to combat climate change. Things like recycling, things like not using too much water, things like not creating too much waste, that sort of thing. So there were quite a few participants, over 1,000, and roughly kind of on average 50 years of age. This was a cross-sectional study at one point in time, and we used questionnaires to measure climate anxiety as well as what we call environmentally relevant behaviors or pro-environmental behaviors. And what we find, you can see in the graph that on the bottom there, on the x-axis, as people's climate anxiety goes up, you see that their intention to fight climate change by doing behaviors that are good for the environment, that goes up as well. So the more anxious you are, the more you are able to fight climate change. But that when people are low in efficacy, so the green line, so basically when people feel less confident about their ability and about humans' ability to fight climate change, this relationship changes. And actually, as anxiety goes up, people have less intention to engage in pro-environmental behaviors. So this goes to show that we need to feel confident about our ability as humans to fight climate change. And if we don't feel confident, then even if we feel anxious, that doesn't necessarily mean we will do anything. And actually, if we don't feel confident, the more anxious we are, perhaps the less we will do. there's the possibility that we become paralyzed by fear when we don't feel confident. So this is, even though this was a study looking at adults, I think that we can still consider the impact on children and young people. Because, of course, if we deny climate change and if we don't talk about climate change and if we don't talk about the ways that we as humans are fighting climate change, that is, of course, going to make young people feel less confident. And if they feel less confident, then no matter how anxious they feel, that doesn't mean it will help them to act. And it doesn't mean that it will help them to fight climate change. This is a problem in another way because there is research to show that if you do fight climate change, particularly if you do this in a collective way, so joining groups and joining others in fighting climate change, that makes you feel better. It leads to higher well-being. So we want young people to feel empowered and confident to fight climate change because that could also help them with their mental health and their well-being as well. So what can we do with this information? Well, one study that I mentioned before, the review of young people with eco-anxiety, suggested that when young people did engage in collective action, this made them feel confident. It made them feel that humans are able to tackle this. There's nothing like joining a group to make you realize that other people also care about climate change, and some people are not denying climate change, and that can make young people feel better and more confident. Also, witnessing other people engaging in climate action was something that young people said gave them hope for the future and also gave them inspiration to engage in climate action. So I want to sort of finish off by talking a bit about another study we did. Um, we asked young people and counselors and other workers in a mental health charity in England for their opinions about eco-anxiety. And so we asked three groups of people: young people, counselors, and strategic partners. So people who work at a leadership level in this charity. We asked their opinions. Um, and we found that all of these groups agreed that rather than denying and minimizing climate change, the best thing to do when young people are worried about it is to encourage them to talk about it, to not encourage young people to be silent, but to encourage them to talk about it and then to validate that by saying, you know, your worry is understandable because climate change is real. So pretending it's not happening is not considered to be the best approach, but also to help young people to channel their worries. So, in other words, to use that emotion positively rather than negatively. Anxiety can be a powerful force for good as well as causing difficulties. So the role for adults and mental health services, according to our research, is to help young people to talk about their worries and to think about how they can manage their worries. And for some young people, that might be engaging in climate action. What we also learned from the people we asked in this study is that some people felt that we should treat climate anxiety or eco-anxiety just like any other worry. So helping people to worry less, helping people to improve their mental health. Um, but some people, especially the counselors who work with young people, said that climate change is so complicated that they're not really sure how to help young people with climate change or eco-anxiety. And actually, the counselors said that they needed to learn more, not just about climate anxiety, but also climate change. So this goes back to what I was saying before that, in the UK, young people tend to know a lot about climate change. They learn about it in school, but older people often know a bit less. So the people we talked to said they wanted to learn more about climate change because they didn't really understand it. So that's something else for us all to do, is to learn more about climate change itself so that young people don't feel so alone in knowing what's happening. Um, some of the themes that came out of this study, so people said that they thought eco-anxiety is caused in part by a broader context. So partly social media, because it's hard to relax when you have lots of information about climate change coming to you from social media. And we also know that if you like something on social media or if you watch something, then social media will adjust and show you more of that same thing again and again. So that was one idea that people had about why young people are so worried about climate change. They also felt that young people are at a developmental stage where they are more worried about um, things that cause unfairness or inequality. And as I mentioned before, climate change causes a lot of inequality and will be worse for some people than others, including people who have less money, people who live in certain countries that are more prone to extreme weather events, and many other factors. And they also felt that young people just have more climate awareness. They know more about climate change. So that is part of the reason that they worry more. And it was suggested that this leads to an idea that the world is not a safe place, and that that is one of the reasons that young people might be so worried about climate change. In fact, young people are more worried now than they were in the past. Rates of anxiety are increasing a lot in young people. And it's possible that all of the things going on in the world might be one of the reasons that's happening, not just climate change, but also many other worrying global events. So it was suggested that one thing services can do, mental health services can do to help young people with eco-anxiety, is to ask young people about eco-anxiety, to improve the information that services give to young people. Some people said that services should treat eco-anxiety like any other anxiety. Whereas some people said that it's such a complex issue that actually services need to learn more about climate change and learn more about how to help young people. And then people also said that services should help young people to participate in climate action where that is appropriate. Obviously, not every young person will want to do that, but if they do, that services should help them and guide them to do that well. And I've just reached the end of my talk there, so thank you very much.